Hello, and welcome to my book channel, my book talk, scribbler, whatever you want to call it. I'm going to be reading the Bashful Courtesan, the first chapter. Last one I read out was the prologue. And I'm going to tell you a little bit about this story. I based it on an icon that my mother gave me. It was pretty well the only thing that she got from her family when her mother died, because they were out here and everybody was in Europe, so she didn't get a lot of anything. She got this and a little glass that was her grandmother's, and so that was like from the 1700s or whatever, which is okay, cool. But she gave me this. This is the icon. This is the icon on which I based the idea of a story about a painting. It's not that painting that I based it on, though. But the whole idea was I was going to call this story the iconoclast, and I was going to have all sorts of different things. And I always had a dwarf, a little person, whatever you call him. I always had Yevgeny, the dwarf, in my mind, in my mind's eye, whatever you want to call that, however you want to express that. And so then I wrote the story about the first part, 1914, where he is making a painting for Count Milan Novak, that's always been his name, and George, no last name. George is just George. All these stories, I mean, this story, I had it tied in together with other stories, and I was going to call that, I was going to write a series of stories, and kind of like, Tales of the South Pacific, only I was going to call it Tales of the Vienna Woods. Tales of the Vienna Woods, and I thought, like, oh, that's a cool name. And it was all going to take place prior to the First World War, in Austria, that kind of a thing, that kind of an idea. I had one story was Cinderella and her sisters, and things like that. It was complicated, but I just never got around to finishing it. I think I got 50 or 60 pages of Cinderella, which it just wasn't working, so I put it aside. Then I started writing this, and then as I wrote it, I thought, oh, this is pretty cool. I liked the way it was going, and then when I finished it, it was basically a short story. It was maybe 17,000 words or something. I don't know. It wasn't. I don't say it wasn't long, because it's long, but it wasn't ideal. It just didn't work. I mean, it worked great as a short story on its own, but I wanted more. I wanted something different. So then I came up with the idea of having a second part in the Second World War, where he's in Paris and he's with the girl, and I can't tell you too much because of spoiler alert, all that stuff, but they're in Paris, and he's looking for the painting that he painted for his commission during the first story, and he's looking for that painting, and there's all sorts of different, everybody that's in the first part is in the second part. So the Count is in the second part, and George is in the second part, and Yevgeny the dwarf is in the second part, but he changes his name to Pumilio. Anna Davidova is in the second part. She changes her name to Constanza, which is her real name, and it goes from there. So then everything ties in together, because I liked the idea of that. I liked the idea of challenging myself that way, kind of like intellectually, I guess, but like, the way I structure it. I like the structural bits of doing stories and stuff. So anyways, it was different, and it was a challenge, and it was all based on this little picture that my mother gave me, and it's got writing on the back too. It's really difficult to read. I know you can't read it because that's backwards, and it's in Dutch, and it's in old script. This is the kind of handwriting. This is the kind of handwriting that my mother had, Like, you can see big flowy letters and things like that. Like, I know you can't read it, so don't bother. So it says 1579. Apparently, this is supposed to be from 1579, but I don't really think that's true, because they got it. It came into our family during the war. I don't know how exactly, but somebody saved it from somebody else. It came from Kazakhstan, of all places. So somebody saved it somehow. I think probably it was stolen. I mean, how else do you explain something like that? Somebody found it, somebody picked it up and took it home or whatever, right? I mean, I had uncles that were all over the place, so who knows? But anyways, it's called an icon, and there you have it. So I'm going to read the story now. Vienna, 1914. This is The Bashful Courtesan, Chapter 1. Alrighty. The knock on my door was loud and forceful. It was the type of knock that echoes through an empty room and makes your heart stutter at the sound of it. Glancing up from the painting I was working on, I knew it was too early to be my next client. I wasn't expecting anyone until later in the afternoon. As I climbed down off my perch and waddled towards the door, I hastily threw my paint-smeared smock over my head. A large sheet, not unlike a child's ghost costume. I used it to hide myself whenever receiving clients for the first time. "What do you want?" I called out, rearranging the folds of the smock so I was completely covered. The only thing I would allow anyone to see of me in those days were my eyes. "We're looking for the man they call Yevgeny the Dwarf. Some call him Le Petit Russe," a voice called out in reply. I pressed my eye up against the rough wood of the door, trying to catch a glimpse of the man behind the voice through the cracks. I heard two voices arguing in harsh whispers on the other side, the one voice trying to remain calm and the other sounding impatient. The two figures dark shadows in an even darker hallway. "Tochevsky, we're looking for Yevgeny Tochevsky," the second voice called out, obviously irritated to find himself speaking through a door. He began rattling the door's latch as if he expected to be let in because he'd somehow stumbled on the magic words and cried out, "Open sesame." "The dwarf, you must know him. I was told he lives in this building," the first voice called out gently, sounding almost embarrassed at having said it. Yevgeny the dwarf. Even with all my success today, they still call me the dwarf. Only now, as I said earlier, I go by the name Pumilio, a name I chose because it sounds like a tragic character from some long-neglected Italian opera. Millie, who used to live downstairs and sometimes modeled for me, they called the whore. And the only name I knew Simon the tailor by was the Jew, a name given to him as if it were a title he'd earned simply by being a Jewish tailor. The names people give us are tantamount to something those who have call those of us who don't, as if by giving us a name or a title it somehow precludes any need on their part for addressing us with any semblance of respect. There's no need to respect someone once you've qualified them as Jew, dwarf, or whore, is there? "What do you want?" I asked through the door again. I could almost imagine the look on their face as I spoke through the cracks in the door. It was easy for me to imagine the first man, the man with the gentle voice, turning to his friend and shrugging his shoulders the way a man sometimes accepts a stranger's rudeness. Back then, people thought of me as cantankerous, a freak, instead of being the disagreeable oddity they think I am now. If being cantankerous or disagreeable means I don't have to wear my smock anymore, I'm happy to let them think what they will. "We'd like to see him," the first man called through the door. "Are you here to collect money?" "I have nothing for you if you are. I won't have anything until the end of the week," I added, hoping the painting I was working on would satisfy my expected client and he'd pay me. "Look, we just want to talk to you," the other man blurted out roughly. Again, as if saying it would be enough to convince me I should open the door. "Stop playing games." "Talk about what?" I asked, suspicion coming through the edge of my voice. "Ha! So you are him," the second voice called out, as if it were a declaration, and I wondered if he was voicing it as a victory cry or denouncing me as a liar. "A commission," the first man responded. "We want to give you a commission." "A commission?" I asked. Now, why didn't he say that in the first place? I was wary, but unlocked the door anyways. I looked up at the two men staring down at me through the narrow opening of the door. I had my foot jammed up against the door in case I had to push it closed in a hurry. Not that I'd be able to hold two full-grown men behind such a flimsy door, but it was another moment before I stepped aside and decided to let them enter. The first man pushed his way through the door and surveyed the room with a quick nod as he removed his hat and gloves, brushing the year's first snowfall from the soft felt of his hat. He was tall and thin. Angular would be a better word to describe him, and so obviously aristocratic with his haughty airs and ill manners. You can tell a lot about a man by the clothes he wears and the way he stands. I can still spot his type, even after all these years. I don't see many of his kind out this way anymore, and if I do, they're usually Russians, who are the worst of the lot. But there may be a bias on my part towards anyone who claims to be a Russian. It seems as if the world has moved along and left his kind behind, almost as if they were a bad memory from an even worse dream. But they're all the same, those aristos, with that haughty conceit they have. Sometimes I think it must be a disdain they have for the common sort, something bordering on contempt and arrogance, because it's a look I've seen too often in my life, a look more often directed at me. He was carrying an ebony walking stick, which he swung about with what was he probably thought a swaggering grace. The knob on the end of it was thick and bulbous, shaped into an imperial eagle. He was wearing a dark gray suit made of worsted wool, English, and had a gold fob watch tucked into the left pocket of his waistcoat, where it hung on a chain he'd slipped through one buttonhole. His hair was close cropped, dark and oily, with just a touch of gray at the temples I couldn't help but noticing as he took off his hat. His hair was perfectly coiffed, as one might expect from an officer in the Imperial Guards. The man probably looks imposing in his guard's uniform, I thought to myself, and he probably cuts a dashing figure at court as well. There was no denying he was handsome, if I'm any judge of that, with his straight Roman nose, small pert mouth, and thin upturned lips. His eyebrows arched delicately over dark, smoldering eyes, and his cheeks had just the right amount of pinkness to match the briskness of the early winter snowfall outside. If I were to guess his age, I'd have put it at 35. The second man came in behind him, dressed in a dark brown pinstripe suit, with a snow-covered derby set on his head at a rakish angle, giving him a free-spirited, buoyant appearance. He was the type of man who, from the first moment you looked at him, you knew you'd feel comfortable getting to know him. He was a man who was obviously at ease with himself. You could see how little he cared for the fashion trends of the day by how he dressed. He had a dark gray muffler he wore half wrapped around his neck as he casually pulled off a pair of soft doe-skin gloves. He took a moment to look up and down the narrow hallway before following the first man inside, carrying an umbrella hooked in the crook of his right arm. I doubt if he ever thought to open it. He struck me as one of those people who enjoyed the rain and only carried an umbrella as an accessory rather than by necessity, something he might offer a woman caught unawares in a sudden, unexpected rainfall. He dropped his hat and gloves on the divan in the center of the room without a second thought, unconcerned with the clutter I'd placed on it earlier, but kept the umbrella, using it like a poor man's walking stick. He brushed snow from his shoulders, mindful of where he was, and careful not to shower the paintings about him with snow. He appeared to be younger than the first man, and I thought he might be an officer in the Guards as well. I thought I was quick to dismiss. He had an interesting look about him, though I knew it would disappoint him if I told him so. No one wants to hear they have an interesting look about them. People want to hear they're handsome or beautiful. Pretty also comes to mind. So hearing they have an interesting look about them, well, a person thinks of themselves as average, and even less when they hear that being said. But his eyes were a mottled brown, speckled with amber, so they caught the light and reflected it like a flickering candle caught in a draught. His eyebrows were large and bushy, and he had a shock of long reddish hair that was tied with a small knot of string and hanging on his collar. His appearance gave the look of a bohemian poet out of a bygone age, a young Pushkin or Byron. His lips were large, fat, and cracked by the cold, although his smile was disarming, drooping down to the left where a small dimple marked his cheek, giving him a boyish look. Although his nose was flat and broad and the nostrils distended, it made me think he'd broken it at some time in his life. And like any typical red-haired man, his skin appeared dusted with fine freckles. Nothing that was distracting, but subtle enough that it was more than just a hint. He wasn't handsome when you looked at all his features separately, but neither was he ugly, not when you looked at his face as a whole. As I said, he had an interesting look. Before letting them in, I warned them both to duck their heads as they stepped in through the door. All the same, you learn to approach the aristocratic sort with a sense of trepidation. It's something I've learned over the years. It might not be caution, but at the very least there's an underlying vigilance that borders on self-preservation. I watched them making their way to the center of the room where the ceiling leveled off enough for them to stand up straight. They took in the sparse furnishings, the small cot I slept in, a wood stove, the large metal bathtub I seldom used, the squat table where I mixed my paints. I pointed to the divan, inviting the first man to sit. He looked at it with a haughty trace of a sneer, but sat anyway, tossing the other man's hat and gloves to the side before pushing aside the thin wooden boxes I'd set down earlier. I stood in front of him and waited as he eyed me curiously, all while watching the other man as he inspected the paintings leaning against the walls. I don't know if I'll ever get used to the way people feel they have to examine me when they meet me for the first time. Most people stare, while their ruthless children bully me. The women are sometimes horrified at first seeing me. There was something about the man's indifference toward me that made me feel as if I'd been scrutinized and dismissed, and both in the same breath. To be honest, it felt as if he'd dismissed me before I even uttered a word. I disliked the man immediately. There was an intensity in his cold stare that reminded me of every bully who'd ever mocked me or beaten me in the past. I pulled at the smock to see him better. "I'm sorry. Please forgive me," I said with what could only sound like a plea, made worse by me holding my palms out as they gave a simple shrug. "I frighten most people when they meet me for the first time," I added, thinking it sounded more like an apology than an explanation I was going for. The man smiled, but there was no welcome to it. There was no warmth in it, no tiny laugh lines at the corner of his mouth or creases at his eyes. His face remained impassive, unreadable with its indifference, and I told myself things would go a lot better for both of us if he'd let himself relax. "Are you a member of the Guards?" I asked, thinking I might mollify him with light banter. "You look like you could be, or should be, in the Guards," I added, stumbling over my words while he unbuttoned his jacket and brushed at some imaginary speck of dirt on his waistcoat. He undid the top two buttons of his waistcoat and stared at me. The only thing I could see was the diamond stick pin in his tie. "The Hussars," he said with a calm voice, and I felt an involuntary shiver go up my back. "I'm with the Hussars. Forgive me. Where are my manners? Count Milanovic," he added, without offering a hand or even acknowledging me. "And why should he?" I asked. I was nothing more to him than a commissioned artist. You'd think I'd be used to the cold, callous nature of an aristo. I still have to tell myself I shouldn't be surprised. "That explains the look," I said with what I hoped was a graceful response. For once I was glad to have the smock covering my face. "And what look is that?" the other man asked from across the room. He turned away from the paintings lined up against the wall and began approaching me with his head bent low because of the sloping ceiling. I had no idea the man was even paying attention to us, so intent was he in his scrutiny of the paintings. "The aristocratic warrior," I said, with what I hoped didn't make me sound like a cloying piece of shit. The man laughed outright, smiling down at the Count. He stopped beside me, as far as the low ceiling allowed him, with his head bent to the side. He draped a relaxing arm around my humped shoulder, and I shrugged him off in a moment of near panic. I don't like people touching me as if I were some toy or their own personal pet. "You find that amusing?" I asked. "I do," he said. "I've always thought of him as the steadfast tin soldier," he added with a laugh, and I saw a look of anger flitter across the Count's face. "The steadfast tin soldier only had one leg," I reminded him. "According to the story, that is. He was a freak. If you ask me, I'm the only freak here." "Does that mean you only have one leg under there?" the man asked, trying to hook the bottom of my smock with his umbrella. I slapped the umbrella away out of reflex, and the man laughed again. "George," the Count called, horrified, and George went on laughing, this time at the Count's reaction. As I slapped the umbrella away, I looked at the Count. "Is he always this rude?" "I'm afraid so," he replied with a sigh, sitting back against the divan and crossing his legs. Not so much a contrived move as it appeared calculating, if that makes any sense. It looked as if every move the man made was a cautionary tale against the dirt and squalor he found himself surrounded with. If a man like that can never be comfortable sitting in squalor, how is he expected to do once he's given orders to march? He should have been grateful Austria-Hungary didn't find an excuse to join the recently concluded war in Serbia. Normally, I wouldn't have come along, but Novak here insisted I come out with him, George said, fishing for a cigarette case he pulled out of its inside breast pocket. Well, it was George who recommended you, the Count confessed, and though he was directing his remark at me, it appeared he said it more for George's sake. Are you English? I asked George, for lack of anything better to say. I am. And you're Russian, I believe, if I'm any judge of accents, George said plainly, tapping his cigarette against a silver case and switching to Russian, which jarred me out of my stupor. I hope to make you a rich man, he said, offering me a cigarette. Don't worry, he doesn't understand, he added, seeing the frightened look in my eyes. Yes, well, thank you, I stammered. I'll save this for later, if you don't mind, I added, putting the cigarette in my pocket Simon the tailor had the foresight to sew on when he made me the smock. The world survives on little things. I could dismiss the Count and easily talk to George, no matter how rude he was. I turned to the Count again. You said something about a commission. Perhaps I can interest you in a painting instead. The Count was looking for that speck of dirt again. He looked at George before turning his attention back to me. I want you to paint a portrait, he said. A commission, George reminded him. A commission, a portrait, what does it matter as long as it's done, he blurted out, his temper getting in the way. I better remember that, I told myself. Of you, I ask? I find an assumption of vanity among aristos helps pay the bills. His wouldn't be the first portrait I painted. No, he smiled. Someone less domineering, he said, and looked up at George again. I nodded, thinking I understood. It's not unusual for an artist to paint someone's lover, even a male lover. And as I turned to study George in the light, George smiled at me, winking at the Count. Which is my best side, George asked, turning his profile, the cigarette hanging out of his mouth at a natty angle. I turned and looked up at him, not wanting to disappoint him by saying one side of his profile was as good as the other. It all harkened back to me thinking he had an interesting look. I could see from the angle of his pose his hand inside his pocket as though it were a smoking jacket, and the way he jutted his chin. It would be an excellent portrait. You don't think I mean... You sick little bastard, the Count growled, and was up, almost hitting his head on the low-sloping beam as he reached down to where I suppose his saber would have been. He grabbed his walking stick instead, and I froze in terror. Oh, sit down, George said, stepping in between the Count and myself and knocking the wooden stick away with his umbrella. You're lucky you didn't knock yourself up, jumping up like that. Can't you see I'm just having a little fun at your expense? You're so serious all the time. That little bastard thinks I mean you, the Count said, brandishing his walking stick at me as if it were a weapon. I'm sorry, I said, stepping in behind George. I felt as if I was a child hiding behind a tree, the same way I've hidden from people most of my life. Of course he's going to think that. What's he supposed to think if you don't tell him any different? George said with a laugh, holding the Count back and telling him to sit down. I watched the Count trying to compose himself, pulling at his shirt cuffs with a succinct snap before sitting down again. He straightened the pressed lines of his pants and finally looked up at George, then nodded. The Count, like so many others of his class, has a mistress, George said, turning towards me as he explained. Well, who doesn't in this day and age? All the same, it was my idea he have the portrait done. But he hasn't liked anything he's seen. They call it expressionism, the Count said with a bitter laugh. It was a short and dismissive bark, but he seemed relaxed now, and his previous outburst was nothing but a memory of a bad aftertaste. All the same, I told myself I'd have to watch the man's temper. I'd not only have to watch what he said, but how I said it. I could see he was a man used to having his way. I showed him a painting of yours hanging in the bistro, George added. We were having lunch on the other side of town, but all the same it impressed him. Well, it impressed him as much as a man like him allows himself to be impressed, he added with a laugh. After he looked at it, he said he wanted you to paint her and asked me to help him find you. He didn't know where to begin to look. How hard can it be to find me? I laughed. Harder than you think, the Count was quick to answer. This woman you want me to paint, I asked, ignoring the Count for a moment and turning my attention back to George. Do I get to meet her, or will I be working from a photograph? Which is easier, the Count asked. Obviously a live subject, George said, turning around to look at him. George was examining the paintings against the wall again, the unframed ones I couldn't sell. There was no room to hang them on the walls, not with the sloping ceiling. To be honest, it doesn't matter which, I said, waving a tiny hand at the Count. I've worked from photographs before. Most of the time it's children. The parents have a hard time letting them sit for me. I frighten them. Naturally, I prefer using a live model, but that's because it's easier for me to capture the essence of a person's soul. It comes through their eyes when they sit across from me. Naturally, but I think it would be more practical if she didn't have to come here, the Count mumbled. Practical? Did you say practical? For you. Who or her? George asked, spinning around. He looked down at me and didn't seem surprised to see me standing at his side. I see you've been to the opera house, he said, dropping his cigarette butt on the floor. Not really, I replied, watching blue smoke seep out of his nostrils as if it were steam out of a grate. You have, because you've painted me, he laughed. I have? Yes. Don't you think I would know? I recognize the decorations in the Imperial box, he added, pointing to a large painting hidden behind two others. He moved the other paintings aside. This has to be back in '08. The Emperor's Jubilee. See? There. He's in the Imperial box. I like what you did with his fuzzy mutton chops. And there's Ferdinand and Sophie behind him. I slipped in through the back door. Someone did me a favor, I said with a nod, wondering if he could see any movement under the smock. A favor? Well, there's still me there. See? First chair violinist. At least it should be me, he added, bending down and inspecting it closer. That is Mahler up there, isn't it? You have the glasses and the hair, but little else in the way of features. It's amazing how all the features are all smudged, and yet, with nothing more than the tilt of a head or the stoop of a shoulder, you have the, what's that word you said earlier? The essence of a person's soul. Yes? The essence of them. I like that, like the Emperor and his mutton chops. How could you not know it was him? I like your use of perspective, the Count was quick to point out. He crouched down beside George and looked at the painting. You'd almost think you were hiding in a closet somewhere watching. He looked at me as if he expected an explanation, and I felt compelled to say something. I'm not comfortable setting my things up in large crowds, I said, for obvious reasons, I should think. I do it, but I can't very well wear my smock when I go out, can I? I often find myself, vulnerable. I don't like being the object of people's attention, not like that. At least the people around here are used to me, but others, not so much. That's why I try to find a vantage point wherever I paint, and stay hidden, or at least out of sight. Then I can sketch as much as I want from off to the side, I added. The more distinct the view is, the better the painting. It's strange seeing something like this, George said, sorting through the other paintings. I suppose he was looking for more examples of the same. He may have thought there were others, but I knew there was only the one painting. These are good, he said, standing up and taking a step back. I like them. I've never seen the Ringstrasse in the rain like this. You're looking at it from an alley? Or this one, looking down from a rooftop? The only time I've ever seen anything even close to this was in Paris. There was a Frenchman I met. I can't remember his name off the top of my head. Pizarro, I asked. That might be the name. Do you know him? I know about him, I said. He painted something similar to that, looking out of a window. He gave me a serious look. You should have your own show. I'm sure there are other more talented men out there, I replied. In fact, I know there are. Nonsense. You're just being modest, George said with a laugh. You've got a style that's hard to describe. I mean, I went to see Monet in Paris 10 years ago, and he was expecting the same old classicism one sees at these shows, but his lines were all blurred. It was like looking through a foggy lens of a telescope. But it's something you see better when you're standing at a distance. It was a new movement. Have you been to Paris? No, I breathed, but I hope to one day, I added, brightening. Then where did you get your style from? Who did you copy? It's not a style. Well, it is, but it's a type. It's called encaustic. It's been around for thousands of years. I think the Romans used it first, or maybe the Greeks. It doesn't matter. I say it just so you know it's not something I came up with on my own. That's not what I meant. I didn't take it or borrow it or steal it from anyone, if that's what you mean. I didn't mean to imply I don't know how it works. It just does, I went on. I use liquid wax and mix it together with paint and linseed oil so I can build it up on layers as it dries. It presents a challenge because it can crack on you if you don't have a sure hand. But as long as the wax stays liquid when you apply it and the paint's not too thin or too thick, it should work. That's nice, but I didn't mean the technique you use. I meant your style. It's sheer genius. It's nothing like mole or clipped. I think it's better. I can't believe they haven't asked you to join their movement. Now it was my turn to laugh. The secessionists? They're pretty well finished now from what I can see. Besides, I sell my paintings for practical reasons. Practical reasons, the Count asked as he sat on the divan again. My paintings pay the rent. They buy me food. That's all I expect. A show? I doubt if I could generate that much interest in anything I paint. I've always been too much of a freak for Klimt and his secessionists. I've met him and every artist in his circle of friends several times over the years. Believe me, he knows who I am. He's familiar with my work. You mean he feels threatened by you? George blurted out. I wouldn't say that, no, I laughed. To them, I'm a freak, and that's all. I could never be anything else in their eyes. I paint from behind that screen over there. That way, people won't be horrified when they see me for the first time, I said, and then turned to the Count. They know that, which is why I won't feel insulted if you want me to paint the portrait from a photograph. Nonsense! I'm sure Anna would love to see these paintings, George said, and then he stood up, remembering the low ceiling at the last moment. She has a good eye for beauty, which is more than I can say for my depth perception, he added with a laugh. I wouldn't be surprised if she even buys a couple. I don't know if that's such a good idea, the Count said, shaking his head. He stood up cautiously, looking around the room as he stood. It was a clutter of paintings and drawings that I tacked up on the walls, as high up on the ceiling beams as I could reach. Every open space available was taken up with supplies or else discards. Not that it's... No, that's not true. Every empty jar was a dried paint and hardened wax combination I stored away for future use. If I made a shade of blue that was meant specifically for a patch of sky, I made sure to reuse it later. I was being practical. Why not? George went on, intent on selling something. You should buy some of these. They may be worth something one day, George added with a smile. Think of it as an investment. And how do I explain that to my wife? I found this little artist to paint my mistress. He's really quite talented. Why don't we support him? I think one painting's more than enough, he said with a dismissive tone. Well, I'm buying this one, George said, bending down to pick up the portrait of himself I'd painted unknowingly. It isn't every day you come across a painting with yourself in it, even if it's by accident, he laughed, reaching into his pocket and pulling out his silver cigarette case once again and offering me another cigarette. You said that you wanted this to be a large portrait, I reminded the Count, putting the second cigarette in my pocket. How large of a portrait are we talking about? 3 meters by 4. Impossible, I said, barking out a quick laugh. Impossible? Why? The Count asked, as if asking the impossible was something he did every day. To begin with, I don't have that much room, I said with a shrug. I pointed up at the ceiling. And the paint. It would cost me a fortune in paint alone, not to mention the cost of the canvas. It would take weeks to prepare myself for something that big. Just the preliminary sketches alone will take weeks. It would be months before I could work on something that big. I wouldn't even be able to start it until late spring or early summer. Why's that? For practical reasons, I said. Oh, we're being practical, are we? We're not looking for the practical, are we, Count? Nothing I do is practical, the Count replied with a forced laugh. I need sunlight. I can't work in the dark, I said. You can't expect me to do a painting that big and paint it by candlelight. I have no lights. The old masters painted by candlelight. But lighting aside, George said, what if I had all the paint and canvas you needed? He went on. What if you had everything you needed? Electric lights? I'm sure the Count would have no problem arranging that for you, if that's what you need. What if he paid your rent, food, supplies? What will it cost for your subject? The subject? For a portrait that big? You must have something in mind. A portrait that big would be a waste of material if it wasn't such a challenge, George said. I haven't said I'd take it yet. Why? How can you refuse? Like I just said, it's the challenge of doing it that draws someone like you. I can see that as plain as day. What do you have in mind for the subject? The Count asked. Something epic, I would think, George said, his eyes brightening. Something like the rape of the Sabine women, the raft of the Medusa, or the night watch. Something grand. Those are all too large, I smiled. But that's what it needs. Something on a grand scale, something heroic, a battle sequence, or something chivalrous, something from the Golden Age. I don't care what it is, as long as it's big, the Count said. I'll get you all the paint and canvas you need. I'll even get you electric lights if you think I should. I'm sure George can help take care of that, can't you, George? As for the subject, that's up to you. You're the artist. I trust you to pick what will be in good taste, though. You know what works and what doesn't work as far as the style you use, as long as it's big. Why so big, I asked, suddenly curious. There's a wall I want to cover up, the Count said, matter-of-factly. A wall he wants to cover up, I thought. Now who was being practical? Well, what did I care where he wanted to hang the damn thing? I suppose, for the most part, that men who have paintings of their mistresses never let them see the light of day. I mean, the Count was proposing to hang my painting in his hallway. It would be in plain sight for all to see at one time or another. I tried to imagine how the Countess would react. Circumstances never allowed that she would, of course. The Great War spoiled all of that for us. But that's not to say that I didn't finish the commission. I did. It's just that the war got in the way. And there you are, done for chapter 1. I'm sorry I did stutter and stumble a little bit, but it wasn't all that bad. I just can't start over again. I mean, this is a half an hour. I mean, it's not, it's taken me a half an hour to read this and do all of this. So, I don't want to have to start over again. So I'm going to put this out. I'm going to put it out today. I don't really want to do it on Saturdays because Saturdays are meant for the wife and visiting friends and doing all of that stuff. And I can't be tied down to the computer because, that's not fair to her. I mean, she is working. She's the breadwinner. I'm just mooching. So, I have to give her my time. She does get 3 days off, so I try to pay as much time as I can and attention as I can to her because, she deserves that much. We have been together for a while, a long while, but we won't go there. And I'm going to put this out today as soon as this thing goes through all whatever it is that it has to do. And we'll see you next week, I hope, sometime. And I realize I have the same shirt on I had last week. That's not good. I'll have to pay more attention to what I'm doing. Alrighty. I'll see you later. Where's the thingy? There you go. See you later. Arrivederci, a bientôt, and all of that stuff. Ciao.